Resuming debate, the honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you would think that at this late date in the session and at this late hour in the evening, the Liberals would be focusing on the real issues that are facing Canadians, like slow economic growth, joblessness, and a growing inability of young Canadians to purchase a new home. But no, Mr. Speaker, instead the Liberals are spending their time working hard to legalize the recreational use of marijuana. Considering the long list of campaign promises they've broken so far, it's surprising that this is the one they've decided to push through at all costs. In regards to this legislation, Mr. Speaker, our top priority on this side of the House is to stand up for the health and safety of Canadians. The Liberals have repeatedly claimed that the purpose of this legislation is the protection of our young people and to increase public safety. But the more research is done into legalization and the more information we gather about the negative effects in jurisdictions that have gone down this road, the more that the claim they're making goes up in smoke. So how did we get here, Mr. Speaker? On April 13, 2017, the Liberal government introduced legislation that would allow for the recreational use of marijuana for Canadians over the age of 18 and eliminated penalties for possession of marijuana up to 5 grams for those between the ages of 12 and 18. This bill is now referred to as Bill C-45. Like I said earlier, the Prime Minister and his Liberal government have repeated time and again that the aim of this legislation is to protect our young children and increase public safety. However, neither of these goals is accomplished with this legislation. This is not just my view, Mr. Speaker. The Angus Reid Research conducted a poll and found that approximately 2 in 3 Canadians believe that this legislation fails to prevent young people from using marijuana more than they already do. While this government claims that they make decisions based on facts and science, this legislation proves otherwise. Groups such as the Canadian Medical Association, CMA, Canadian Psychiatric Association, CPA, and the Canadian Chiefs of Police, CCP, all oppose certain aspects of the bill. Both the CMA and CPA have stated that Canadians who consume marijuana recreationally under the age of 25 have a higher risk of developing mental illness, such as depression, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. From the Canadian Psychiatric Association, quote, regular cannabis use in youth and young adults can affect aspects of cognition, including attention, memory, processing speed, visuospatial functioning, overall intelligence. Worse performance is related to earlier adolescent onset of use, end of quote. The Canadian Psychiatric Association goes on to say that, quote, early age of use of cannabis increases the potential for adult dependence on cannabis. Cannabis may be associated with increased progression to other illicit drug use in the context of particular factors, for example, high frequency and early age of use. Later in the same report, the Canadian Psychiatric Association states, quote, the CPA acknowledges and agrees with the CMA recommendations to the task force. With respect to protection of mental wellness for youth and young adults, the CPA highlights the following. Since regular cannabis use is associated with increased risk of schizophrenia and may also negatively interact with depression, bipolar, and anxiety disorders due to the biological effects on brain maturation, and since mental disorders frequently start before the age of 25, age of access to cannabis should not be prior to age 21, with restrictions on quantity and THC potency for those between 21 and 25 years of age. Mr. Speaker, none of these are found in Bill C-45. A recent CMA Journal edition, May 29, states, quote, the purported purpose of this act is to protect public health and safety. Yet some of the Act's provisions appear starkly at odds with this objective, particularly for Canada's youth. Simply put, cannabis should not be used by young people. It is toxic to their cortical neuronal networks, with both functional and structural changes seen in the brains of youth who use cannabis regularly. The Centre for Addiction and Mental Health has stated unequivocally that cannabis is not a benign substance and its health harms increase with intensity of use. The quote goes on, although adults are also susceptible to the harmful effects of cannabis, the developing brain is especially sensitive. The Canadian Pediatric Society cautions that marijuana use in youth is strongly linked to cannabis dependence and other substance use disorders. The initiation and maintenance of tobacco smoking, an increased presence of mental illness, including depression, anxiety, and psychosis, impaired neurological development and cognitive decline, and diminished school performance and lifetime achievement. The lifetime risk of dependence on marijuana is about 9%, Mr. Speaker. However, this increases to 17% for those who start using marijuana as teenagers. The CMA article continues, most of us know a young person whose life was derailed because of marijuana use. Bill C-45 is unlikely to prevent such tragedies from occurring and conversely may make them more frequent. Although an accompanying bill lays out stronger penalties for impaired driving and proposed limits for blood levels for tetrahydrocannabinol in drivers, there is grave concern that legalization of marijuana will result in a substantial increase in impaired driving, particularly among young people in conjunction with alcohol use. Negative health effects related to the recreational use of marijuana isn't exclusive to children. As the Canadian Medical Association notes, quote, marijuana use is linked to severe adverse health outcomes, including addiction, cardiovascular and pulmonary effects, example, chronic bronchitis, mental illness, and other problems, including cognitive impairment and reduced educational attainment, end quote. Specifically, regarding addiction, the Society for the Study of Addiction has found that regular use of marijuana for 1 in 10 users results in a dependence problem. If usage started in adolescence, that number rises to 1 in 6. It is clear the negative health effects from marijuana are not being taken seriously by this government, and the steps they're taking now will have a long-lasting negative impact on Canadians. As for public safety, Washington State, since legalizing the recreational use of marijuana, has seen drastic increases in vehicular deaths related to driving under the influence of marijuana. The Washington Post, reporting on findings from the American Automobile Association, state, quote, authorities in Washington recorded 436 fatal crashes in 2013 and determined that drivers involved in 40 crashes tested positive for THC, which is the active chemical in marijuana. According to the study in 2014, 1 year later, they found that out of 462 fatal crashes, 85 drivers tested positive for THC. So, Mr. Speaker, the number of fatal crashes linked to the presence of THC doubled in 1 year. And from Mad Canada, quote, population surveys show the number of Canadians driving after using drugs is on the rise. In fact, driving after smoking cannabis is now more prevalent among some young drivers than driving after drinking. Survey data of a 2013 Centre for Addiction and Mental Health report showed that among young Ontario drivers in grades 10 to 12, 4% drove after drinking, while 9.7% drove after smoking cannabis. Equally concerning as the numbers is the misperception that many young people and some parents have that driving under the influence of cannabis is safer than driving under the influence of alcohol. A national study by the Partnership for a Drug-Free Canada revealed that nearly 1/3, 32% of teens, did not consider driving under the influence of cannabis to be as bad as alcohol. And nearly 25% of parents of teenagers did not consider driving while high on cannabis to be as bad as drinking and driving. Many young people feel that driving under the influence of cannabis is risk-free. Yet studies have shown that smoking cannabis can produce unwelcome effects behind the wheel, including a shorter attention span, an altered perception of time and distance, and slower reaction times that impair the driver's ability to respond to sudden events in traffic. A 2012 study by researchers at Dalhousie University in Halifax found that smoking cannabis 3 hours before driving doubled a driver's risk of having a vehicular crash. Combining cannabis with even small amounts of alcohol greatly increases the negative effect on driving skills. Many young people also think they'll never be caught or charged for driving while high. While detecting cannabis is more challenging than detecting alcohol, because we don't have the simple roadside drug test similar to the alcohol breathalyzer, police do have tools to determine whether a driver is impaired by drugs. However, as noted by the American Automobile Association, there are no proven blood or urine tests that can determine how high a person is from marijuana, but only determines if marijuana is in their system. I've heard from police officers in the Waterloo region on this issue. Our police forces are not properly funded or equipped to handle these new dangers. We need to heed their warnings and take their concerns into consideration. So, Mr. Speaker, it's clear that while this government is going to rush ahead with legalizing recreational marijuana, it is not with the health and safety of Canadians in mind. It's simply to fulfill a campaign promise with no thought or concern for our youth and their future. Mr. Speaker, let me finish with one short quote from an editorial written by Dr. Diane Kelsall in the Canadian Medical Association Journal just 3 days ago. Quote, "If Parliament truly cares about the public health and safety of Canadians, especially our youth, this bill will not pass." Hear, hear. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Kitchener South Hespeler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to thank my honourable colleague for his speech. I just wanted to talk about, he mentioned in the beginning about that we should be talking about other issues, economic growth. I just wanted to mention to him that when we first took power in 2015 and in the fourth quarter, we were left with, from the previous government, 0.5% growth. And now, actually, we just presented in the first quarter 3.7% growth in the economy. So I'd like to just mention that. But I want to get to the real question. That is here is I have an article here from the Washington Post. He mentioned in his speech that the usage of cannabis will rise among youth. But I just want to give you a quote here. And according to the Colorado Health Department, I quote, "The survey shows marijuana use has not increased since legalization, with 4 of 5 high school students continuing to say they do not use marijuana." So my question to the honourable colleague is the status quo is not working right now, but we have a balanced approach of legalizing, regulating, and restricting. Does he believe that the status quo is working?
The honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Well, Mr. Speaker, no one is suggesting that the status quo is good enough. There's always room for improvement. But in fact, the use of marijuana has decreased since 2008 from 33% down to 24%. That's a study by the Addiction and Mental Health Research people. But, Mr. Speaker, as it relates to the age, and we keep coming back to this, the CMA was so clear in their recommendations that brain maturation occurs around age 25. So they recommended an age of 21 as the minimum. And yet this government has chosen to go ahead with a recommendation that is careless and reckless, allowing children as young as 12 to have access and legalizing it for purchase at 18. Mr. Speaker, this is irresponsible. I don't think there are many parents in his riding that are calling him and asking him to make that kind of adjustment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to hear my colleagues' comments as to the difficulty of anticipating the effects on, or predicting the effects on the human body. It seems that the same dose of marijuana can produce completely different effects on, for example, a frequent user, like one who uses medical marijuana. It may have very little or no effect, whereas a young person may take the same dose and be highly affected. So it may be very difficult to establish safe limits because it depends on the situation, and it'll be very difficult to predict the effects on the human body if one takes a certain dose. For example, young people seem more affected than a person who may be in their 40s or 50s. So what does my colleague think about the difficulties of predicting the effects on a person's body?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for a question. I think that was the crux of what I've been arguing all night, is that because young people are more susceptible, as my colleague pointed out, to the negative impact of THC on brain development, for example, it's very important that if we're going to legalize this drug, which I'm disagreeing with at any age, but if we're going to legalize it, we should at least not be legalizing it at this young age and making it permissible for children as young as 12 to actually have it